All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. With me is Corrie Pitzer and Brian Maynard, and we're going to be discussing Deming's principle, break down barriers between staff areas. So maybe before we get started, Corrie and Brian can just take a minute to introduce themselves and touch on their backgrounds. Corrie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Corrie Pitzer. I am the CEO of SafeMap. Started SafeMap way back in South Africa in 1994, then deployed SafeMap in Australia in the mining industry, largely there for about 15, 16 years. And then I came to Canada and started living in Vancouver, and from here, basically managing SafeMap from here. I'm originally, and I say this to my own detriment, trained as a psychologist, but and went into HR my first 6 months of my career, and then I was moved into safety, and since then I've been working in the broader field of safety, and that's me.
Great, thanks. Brian?
Yeah, Brian Maynard, geological engineer from Manitoba, Canada. Spent 10 years in tech services in underground mining, and then sort of 19 years in operational management, transferred to Australia, then to Switzerland, Ukraine, now based in London, England. So after 42 years, stepped away from day-to-day mining and mining management, doing some advisory work for a mining company on a part-time basis.
Great, thank you. Well, let's kick things off by discussing and giving us an insight into your exposure to the work of Deming's. Brian, do you want to go first?
Sure. It was really in the mid-'80s when we had gone through a number of metal market price changes, quite severe ones, both in the uptrend and in the downward trend, and it led to lots of hiring and firing sort of episodes and redundancies. And at the time, the business unit that I was in decided that there needed to be a way to become more efficient, more effective, more sustainable. And that's really what led then to our president of the business unit meeting with Edward Deming and talking through specifically statistical process control, and then how we might get to know our processes better and come through it, good or bad. That's then when the work on the 14 principles started. And so I was on the receiving end of many business unit initiatives in each one of those 14 areas. I think the challenge really was to integrate the 14 rather than treat them as 14 distinct principles, but it was only natural, given that each one had its own sponsor, that some would have sort of more momentum than what others might. Clearly, and there was lots of jokes at the time, particularly principle number 8, driving out fear. As our general managers and leaders changed, clearly some of them were using fear to get things done, and so that's when things became lighthearted around principle number 8. I think the other one, in principle 4, that made everybody really, really nervous in our industry around the single source supplier, was that given that many organizations in Canada that produced raw materials for our business were unionized, and so if you really focused on having just one supplier, what would you do in the case of a strike? And we ourselves were unionized as well, so we were causing our customers grief whenever we would have a strike. So there was a couple of principles that were really hard to agree to, but in the whole, once you really understand each of the 14 and how they all tie together, then it became much easier. And statistical process control really did lead us to trying to understand the process and understand the voice of the process. And then in 1989, I got to go meet him for a week and spend a week with him in a workshop, which was extremely valuable because you're hearing it from the person who really pulled it together. And each of his exercises really showed how management would take the wrong path when it came to variation in the process and make quite poor decisions because the data or the information was missing. And because you were witnessing it live, you couldn't hide from the fact that you had cheated during an exercise or taken a shortcut or whatever, and that became quite valuable.
Right. I was going to ask, with your global experience, where, if there's any more openness or acceptance of the implementing the principle, but it sounds like you started in Canada with Deming principles.
Yeah, I think that what eventually I tried to get people to focus on was not the religious side of the 14 principles, but really, if you can get to statistical process control and understand what's causing variation in your business or in your process, then use those principles to then come to a better place in terms of a recommendation. So it was really to marry the two together rather than get too religious about each of the 14.
Right. Great. Corey, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I was probably more on the religious side of the principles when I started. I got hold of his book in 84, 85 in South Africa at the time. And I was just appointed then as group HR and safety manager for Impala Platinum. And then in 86, we had a massive disaster in South Africa, the Kinross gold mine disaster, 177 people killed. And that led to me being appointed in a group role as the group risk manager. There was a big safety department in the company that was deploying the Frankfurt management systems very extensively. It was a huge effort in the mining industry in South Africa at the time. And then I formed this group risk management section. And our job was to look at safety from a different perspective. And, not compliance, not systems, but from a people side almost. And I also started doing an MBA with the University of Stellenbosch. And so I started driving these principles of Deming into my work. And especially the one thing that struck me about when I start first reading about it is that take quality out of the hands of the quality management department. That to me was one of the essence of what he was saying. Put it in the hands, in the processes. That's where quality upstream should be integrated. And to me, that was almost take safety out of the hands of the safety department and put it back into the hands of the line management. And so that's when we started with a process, which I'll maybe talk a little bit later about, the GenCore Safety Performance Review, that was designed to bring the fundamental principles to the line managements of the various mines. GenCore at the time had over 60 mines in various coal, gold, platinum, and so on. And so we took it to all those mines. But it was more on the, as I said, on the religious side, it was more the principles, trying to get these principles transferred into safety. And that was really my first exposure to it. It was almost like, you see the light when I read his book. It was literally for me, this is the way, it's almost like the way with the light in front of the darkness, And so I really had, I wish I had the opportunity to meet him, and, that never happened.
Great. So we're talking like about HR and operations and safety. And so, Brian, why would he have focused on these silos of staff areas?
I think for me, he got into the workplace at a young age, and then, he had different phases of being a consultant, being an academic, and moving on through to becoming a key advisor to many American very large companies after the Japan quality program got underway. So he certainly observed a lot of inefficiency and duplication. And I think that really gets back to principle 1 and 14, constancy of purpose and really understanding what the strategy is and having everybody work in the same direction. And he clearly saw that wasn't the case. And so then, what are the barriers to having those service departments or support departments or production departments sort of all coming together to support that main goal. And it wasn't there. And I think organizations go through that whole thing from time to time. Whenever the manager changes or the vice president changes, silos need to be broken down again. And it depends on what, sometimes the medium strategy and the long-term strategy are different depending on what the cycle of the commodity is. And so you have to adjust, and that leads to some department heads really putting their nose to the grindstone, and they become siloed rather than looking at how they might help that site or that business unit better.
Right. So Corey, how does that impact on individual or team performance?
At that stage when Deming's work became prevalent, and as Brian was saying, he was very active in Japan with his work at the time, and he almost brought it back to the US and the Western world, so to speak. But at that stage, there was a really strong focus on the management, the science of management, the Friedrich Taylor models of very strict functional design of organizations. And you have a very engineered process of producing whatever you produce, and that meant silos. Everyone is a specialist in the various fields, and they do what they do well, and they hand over to the next. But that really mitigated against the philosophies of Deming, because there was a much more fluid thinking in his mind. Who's responsible for quality in his case, and that is not a department's function. That is not an entity's function. It has to be something that has to be built into the processes in the organization, not only the actual operational process, but also the management processes. And so, if you think about how does this get down to the worker in the end, it really, often, whose work is this? I got my little work that I'm doing in my little machine or my little area, and where does my work start and where does my work stop? And of course, that was also a big issue in the union world, that people need to get paid for what they justifiably do. And so there was a clear definition around what I'm responsible for. And I know there was not a lot of continuity in the businesses. There was a lot of gaps and stop-starts in the production processes that could have been eliminated, could have been taken away, had it not been for these silos in which companies was forced to operate in. Later on came safety. In the South African mining industry in the 60s and 70s, safety became a silo of its own. And now it started to almost entrench the silo thinking. And if you think about how do we make people responsible for an output such as quality or such as safety, which cuts across departments, if they have this singular focus, this is what I'm responsible for. So I don't think there's much intrinsic value. There's not much intrinsic motivation built into such a system. It is all mechanistic, and it's all individual and teams in isolation focused. So I don't think you can reach a level of performance, but I don't think you can actually reach a continuous process with that. And it never really happened in safety up to now. Maybe we're still in a field where we're not really getting everybody into that thinking, because we are still so entrenched. That's safety's work, or
right?
Things like that.
Right. So on that note, Brian, in your travels, have you typically seen safety operating in a silo?
I think, it's changing, right? And, as we moved into 2020 and now through where we are now, I think broadly speaking, it's probably not like it used to be. but clearly there were times, and particularly where the regulator was quite strong in any province or state or country, where inspections became, sort of king, and the safety department was seen to be the policeman, and in some cases they were expected to be the policeman. And as we start to move away from that, then there's a better chance for integration. The trick now is that not everybody wants to become a safety professional. There's not a lot of programs either in trade schools or colleges or universities where you can come out with a degree, as a safety professional. And that's part of the issue, is that some of the people were recruited into the department come from operations, some from maintenance, some from tech services, and very few have specific sort of safety training. And I think that leads to then the creation of a silo in certain situations. And then when you get a really bad incident where you've had somebody hurt bad or killed, then all of a sudden, the focus goes onto the safety department to be a resource. And if we could just get them to be treated as a resource all the time, rather than on specific situations, then I think there'd be less chance of that silo. But the inspection thing, unfortunately, is still hanging around. And then when you look, it's interesting in Canada back, when I was there, forestry industry and the fishing industry had many, many more fatalities than the mining industry. But it was always the mining industry that would get hauled in by the regulators, and all mines across Canada were painted with the same brush whenever a new rule or a new procedure or new expectation came about. And I recall Dr. Deming, when it came to the inspection side, and in principle number 3, trying to move away from that world. He'd been working with one of the big 3 and automakers in the US, and they'd asked the Japanese company to send them lighters, cigarette lighters for their automobile manufacturing lines in boxes of 1,000 with only 3 defects per 1,000. And of course, the Japanese got the order, and they were quite confused with this request for 3 in 1,000 defect specification. So when the big 3 automaker in the US got the box of 1,000, they opened it up, and there was a little Ziploc bag containing 3 defects and a note from the Japanese saying, "We understand why you want 1,000 good ones. We don't understand why you want 3 bad ones. So we put them in a separate bag so they don't get mixed up." And that really then goes on to what the poor safety people have to deal with. I mean, they know when they go into a workplace, if they want to look hard, they can find a defect. But how do they transform them into being a coach and a true knowledgeable resource? That's going to be the trick going forward to avoid that silo.
Right. And you kind of touched on it, but whose fault is it that they're in the silo? I mean, you talked about regulators and
yeah, I think it comes back to strategy, whether it's short-term, medium-term, long-term, and not having clarity in terms of senior leadership communicating what it is, leaving it up to people to interpret. And then each department head goes off in their own direction to try and deliver the goals, whether those goals be for the department, for the site, for the business unit, for the company. And so again, if that's not all clear, then it's very easy for departments to be set up that, where all of a sudden structure and staffing becomes more important, they're more dominant than strategy. And again, integrating that with principle 1 and number 14 will help people avoid that trap.
Scott, can I also just mention in there, the safety silo, in terms of whose fault is that? I also think it's often the safety profession's fault that silos are created. We have this tendency in safety to have some sort of a program, some sort of a philosophy, and it's always been capturing safety in a major intervention or initiative. And once you start driving your output, your required output through this separate system, that you tag on to the production system, you're creating, inadvertently, you're creating a silo. And you are not going to, that's why we talk so often about this has got to be sold to the line management, or the management must buy into this. And this is the first step in a safety intervention. And that's where it already has gone wrong in so many ways, and now, we used to have the safety management silo in the old days. It started, that was more an engineering silo, safety engineering. Then it started moving into a behavioral silo, behavioral safety. These days, we are in a new silo. I think this is like a psychological silo, if I can call it that. And even in this era now, we have old safety and new safety. Now, there's two more silos that we are now building into the mindsets of the management who's responsible for safety. There's safety 2 and safety differently and safety hop and resilience engineering. In even those new view things, they are also little silos, which it doesn't help. It doesn't help the operator, and I'm talking about the operator from the management right down to the front line. If all these buzzwords keep on coming flying at them from all these so-called, new experts, and there's more to come. There's also, there's people who say, no, they're all wrong. There's a sociological silo solution that we need to look at. And I'm getting really sick with all these tabs and labels that is just muddying the waters for everybody.
Right. And so, and kind of leading into the next question of, is it more convenient for just the safety department to do the safety work, or is it?
Well, if we can sort out what is safety work,
right.
What exactly is safety work? Is there such a thing as safety work? And I'm not too sure how I've ever seen it, in practice, in action. But I'm of the theoretical view, if you can call it that, and had many discussions with Brian about this, that safety should really become invisible in the organization. It should be so integrated upstream on the quality model. It should be so integrated in every aspect of the business process that we should not need defenses down the line to catch where things go wrong. I mean, this is Deming's fundamental philosophy. And think about Brian's example now. We had to manufacture 3 defects before we put it in a separate box. That is when quality has become invisible. There's no question what we do here. And I know it's not the same in safety. It's not that simple in safety, but certainly I don't see the drive towards upstream integration. Well, there are ideas and philosophies in this field, and Nancy Levison is probably very much into that. Systems engineering, systems thinking is very much there. I think that is the ideal direction, and we should not try to catch the defects with systems designed to catch defects. And so for me, the safety department, there are compliance issues, legal issues, inspection issues from OSHA and so on, which we're not going to get away from, not soon anyway. So my thinking is, well, split safety up into 2 departments, if I can say it in simplistic terms. There's a compliance department, and they basically look at all the compliance issues, and they have limited authority, limited status in the organization, and then give the optimization of safety, of efficiency, of effectiveness in the organization, give that to the business improvement leader. Create a business improvement leader in the organization. Brian was one, knows everything about that. And that's where safety should go to. Safety should ideally be driven from that, because that's part of business improvement. It is not part of an external activity and external interventions that we need to install. So a small team in the organization that reports high up, and that I think can be a long-term direction where safety work is becoming invisible.
Right. So Brian, you want to join in on that and talk about where should the safety department ideally be positioned within the organization?
Yeah, there might not be a one size fits all thing. I think one of the tricks, of course, is what are the trends, like what are the issues of the day, or where do we want to see ourselves in 5 years' time, and who should be really focused on safety. I think Corrie hinted that, if we can integrate the various discussions that supervisors or managers come up against each day, then it just makes it a lot easier. And I was forced to go into the workplace just for a safety visit only. I remember back in the day. And then finally, one of the vice presidents said to me, yeah, but the crews just get really nervous when they know you're coming for a safety visit. So why can't we talk about other things while we're in the workplace? And that was really the big shift. Once we integrated safety with production, with cost, with people, and with process improvement, then that whole workplace visit changed so that it was truly an integrated conversation. Then the workers became less nervous because you could work in a football conversation or a golf conversation or a ballet conversation or a theater. And then they found out that you were a real person rather than just, a GM who was looking for defects or looking for them doing things incorrectly or taking shortcuts. And so through all that, and Corrie talked about what is safety work, where should it sit? Should it sit with line management? Should it sit with the safety professionals? And I think it needs to be just really, really clear on, first of all, what is the work that supports the goal or the transformation that wants to be made? And then the question is, who should do that work? And if I'm a supervisor with 20 people on my crew or my team, and I can only spend 10 minutes with each of them through the day because of meetings and bureaucracy and all the rest of it, then what am I going to do when I've got that 10 minutes with each crew member, and really get clear on what is the rest of the work of my role really value added or bureaucratic because of a regulatory requirement, and then sort out how that all ties into where we want the business to be at the end of the year, and then design the structure to suit that. And safety might report through to line management in one operation and through to the business unit or the regional office in another one. And I don't think there's a right or wrong as long as everybody's really clear on what the goal is.
Right. And so Brian touched on it, Corrie, but where should safety ideally report into?
Yeah.
Oh, dear. I think based on sort of maturity of the overall organization, I would have it reporting through to the site team, so that they truly are seen as a resource. You can get that coaching environment set up, and ultimately the general manager is accountable for the results of that particular site or complex or plant. That doesn't mean that there should be a big safety team at site, especially if you want line management to start to take on some of those accountabilities in the workplace. But ultimately, I think to get the transformation started, the site safety team should be reporting through to the site manager.
Yeah, I think if you can design a company from ground up, ideally, what would you do? I would still focus on reporting to the process operational executive in the organization, the highest level of operational management. I'm not sure it should report to the top manager on site, like the general manager or the CEO of a company. I think there's that kind of issue should be managed where things are happening. And so if you look at the COO of the organization, that's where I think most of the activity is located in, and that's where it should be done, provided that the primary responsibility not I'm accountable for this, but the primary responsibility for safety is with the COO, not with the safety person, whatever that person is. That person, I think, ideally should be a resource, and ideally should not be a psychologist or a sociologist or of this psychobabble professions, like, and I'm excluding myself here now, but should be from an engineering background, if it's an engineering kind of organization, or a process kind of background, to understand exactly what work is and how that should be integrated into that. That's, to me, is the first and primary requirement.
I think sometimes the results sort of give way to where other safety professionals might report through to. So in a large company that had one fatality per year, all of a sudden has 3, and this was a large oil and gas company, and a new CEO came in and said, yeah, but it's wrong that in our global organization, 3 people lost their lives. So, what are we going to do to get it down to the point where nobody loses their life while employed by us? But that doesn't change the site structure. That just means that there's a couple of people in the group office or the corporate office that are going to have specific focus on what are the systems, what are the behaviors that are causing 3 people to lose their life. And so it caused quite a ruckus, as you can imagine, that all of a sudden the top safety person in the company was reporting directly to the CEO. But that's because the CEO wanted to increase that focus and get some new energy into the game.
Right.
I think that holds with my earlier statement that I think we can effectively separate compliance and business optimization. And inside that business optimization, that can be flexible. How that's constituted, it can be catering for focus on critical risks in the organization, depending on what are the needs in that organization, and that kind of function. I think can continuously optimize the business with specialists coming into that role. So I think that can work.
Right, and a lot of safety professionals are working in smaller organizations. I think some of the examples we're talking about are fairly large organizations. So, any advice for who safety should report into if you're in a smaller organization?
I think in a small organization, the same principle, report to the highest level of operational authority in that small organization. Because that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where they have to integrate safety upstream in that organization.
I think in some, if you had a small lumber processing plant or something where it's just a family-owned business, quite often the safety person is in a job combination role with something else, so they don't just have safety activities to carry on. But I think in those family-owned businesses, it's that the communications are generally better, and there's a direct line of sight to a direct outcome, and everybody pulling in the same direction.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Corrie, if we're how should we be designing safety if it's going to be functioning upstream?
Maybe if I can relate back to my career, an example, going back, and this is a large organization example again, but after the disaster that we had in Gemcore, this Kinross mine disaster, and I was placed into this role of group risk manager. We designed a process. It was a week-long process in which there was an exclusive focus on catastrophic risk in the organization. And remember, I said this company had 60 mines. 120,000 people at the time employed. So we had this week-long process that we went through each mine site, and teams were brought in, and they were focusing on what can be catastrophic in this organization as a primary focus, and secondary, what can kill people here. And so we went for 2 years, we went through all these mines, and it was a very successful intervention. But then it was said, well, what now? We've got all this stuff done. And the safety department was a big department in this corporation. Safety audits on all the mines, and they were extremely powerful. And then all the graphs showing where your mine comes out on this league of shame, etc. So people were in fear of the safety department, and that's when I introduced what was called the GenCore Safety Performance Review. And this was really focusing on getting the management of the mines behind the thinking of their responsibility for safety. There was a 5-day process. 2 days we did catastrophic risk identification, catastrophic and fatal risk identification. We brought 6 people from different mines to join 6 people on this mine, and they did this risk review, critical risk review. And at the end of the second day, they would feed it back to the management team. The management team then started meeting on day 3. And on this day, we would focus on human performance. We would bring in worker teams from outside the workforce. We would pre-train them and pre-coach them, and they would make presentations to the management about training and procedures and discipline. We had supervisors coming in. They talk about resources and risk incentives. And then we had a session with the management team, how to manage other managers, not how to do Gemba walks or be out in the field, but how they manage each layer below them. And then on day 4, we had an organization performance review. And here we gave them leadership feedback, feedback on a cultural survey that we've done. And we looked at various safety approaches. It was basically a HOP process, human and organization performance. And in this process, they really took safety on board. Right. And in this process, the safety department wasn't allowed in this process. They were shifted down to this compliance level. And that to me was, in essence, how the safety organization should be designed. That is, it is designed and owned, fully owned by the line management, top team in that organization. They drive safety in the first instance. In whatever function they are, that's where safety is absolutely residing. And the higher you put and the stronger you make your safety department or your functional department, the less likelihood is there that this top team is going to assume and accept this responsibility, because it's going to be hived off. And this, if you think back about, you're way too young for this, Scott, but I remember the Frank Bird management system in South Africa, the loss control system, actually at that stage had element coordinators, and it was line managers that was the element coordinators for the safety system. And in that way, it was an organization of safety structured around this principle of integration. And I think that can be done and achieved in different ways. I've just described this one way, but that's how I think it should be organized.
What's the best design example you've seen in your career, Brian, for designing the safety department?
I suppose there's been different ones. For me, the best one was where we took line management through a safe production transformation. So not just the phrase and not just the slogan, but what did we actually mean by the expectations associated with safe production, so that line management clearly understood what their accountability was from the time they got to work until the time they went home. Then once that was really clear and they were willing to step up to the plate, organize the safety department to become a resource and a coach. And so we ended up with only one safety person at each site. So whether it was one at the mine or one at the plant, one in the maintenance shop, then a worker representative for each one of those areas. So essentially two, one being on staff, one being a worker rep. And that, because there just wasn't enough bodies or enough people around to do all the safety work, it meant that line management then had to take on the accountability for doing that work live in the workplace. And then safety systems, right? So we had 6 of them in that whole framework. So how do we improve the quality of each one of those systems? And everybody came up with lots of different ideas on how to improve each one. But all that led to was a bunch of extra work. And so really what I did was I said, no, we're going to pick one item to improve in each of those 6. And only when it's improved, will we then move on to the rest. Rather than having 3 improvement programs in each one of those 6 areas, let's concentrate on fixing one thing in each of the 6. Then we'll move on to the next thing. And we gained a lot of momentum. It meant that we could involve the crews in each one of those process improvement initiatives. And then there was a bit more of a buzz. So it wasn't like flavor of the month, or this is all going to change when Brian leaves. There was a lot more ownership so that it wasn't dependent on me in the future. So really keeping it lean and then being very clear on what safe production was.
Great. So what are those kind of key or core skills that a safety professional, needs in order to be successful in today's day and age?
Yeah, I'll let Corey get into the true aspects, because I never worked in the safety department, but for me, cognitive capacity or mental processing ability, the whole skills, knowledge, experience, so not just knowledge, but having a skill and experience. Do they value the role where they put into the safety department because we didn't know what to do with them, or they want to come into the safety department and add value? And then do they have the required behaviors? So can they be a coach, or do they want to be a policeman? Can they handle difficult conversations? Can they hang in there and try and explain the technical side of an aspect, which is also a missing piece. I think there's been so much focus on training lately and not enough focus on education. And a lot of people think those are the same thing, but I think there's quite a difference between some very basic education that doesn't have to be put through a long drawn out training program. So I again, to me, in the new world of being a coach or a resource, I think required behaviors and personality and the way that you handle difficult situations is a big piece. The rest I can upskill people if they've got kind of those 3 things in behind them.
Yeah, I think my first core skill for me is not really a skill. I think the person or persons who operate in the safety arena must have had real jobs in their lives. And that to me is like this technical foundation to understand what work is all about. And that I think may be going amiss if people are from service departments and HR and so on. They haven't really the fingers for what goes on in that front end. So that's more of an experience rather than a core skill. But the other area that and my presentation at your conference recently, Scott, I talked about connectedness as a missing link in safety. How do we create connectedness in an organization? Brian, my example was wine, and Brian is an absolute specialist in wine. The key ingredient or key metric for wine is the length of the wine. The longer the wine stays in your mouth, the higher the quality of the wine. Persistence. I've learned that through many years of drinking good wine. And so to me, what's the same issue in safety in an organization? And to me, that's this term connectedness. The more connected our systems are, the more connected our feedback loops are, the more connected our various layers in the organization are. The leaner those can be, the more effective we will produce safe outcomes. And so the player in the field, in the safety arena, needs to understand that and needs to be able to liaise, interact with people from different levels, need to be able to interact with the top and the frontline employee in exactly the same kind of way, and to make these connections happen. So I think we need a person there actually that can transcend disciplines, silos, so to speak, and can actually make these connections happen. So it is not an easy beast, I think, that should play the ideal role. But as Brian said, this can be developed. People can actually be trained to become better coaches, better liaison, better functional insights into other people's work. That can be trained. So what kind of core skills? I think any of those core skills will be dependent on what kind of person we're getting to be able to be flexible enough to make these things happen.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think anyone in the safety field that's kind of my generation, or maybe even older, they were probably voluntold to be the safety officer, or they drew the short straw. So they're probably coming in with a technical skill already. With the advancement of safety programs within colleges, universities, do you think graduating safety professionals should be spending some time on the tools in the field before they take on their first safety assignment?
Absolutely. They should not touch a safety audit system unless they have done real work in that organization. And you can see, that's why I say, well, I think engineers are people better suited in the long run, because they come from that practical environment. But if you have a safety professional that has come through the ranks, or has actually been forced to go into those areas and be trained in it, then that's the more ideal mix in so many ways. But that's not always possible. You step out from a university or a college diploma and you step right into the role of safety, and here you go. You never really see that other side of the coin, and that, I think, is showing increasingly up in the way I hear safety people talk. It becomes increasingly babble. It's just like lots of words and theories and concepts, and that's not going to any connection with what goes on in the organization.
Brian, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'm just thinking through Corey's thing there, and some of his background on the psychology side. If it's a small medium enterprise and it's got a small regional office, then I think there is some benefit from having a peer safety specialist just to help keep us honest, on the operating side of the fence. If we take lightning as an example, and it strikes the vehicle that we're sitting in, do we get out and run, or do we stay in the vehicle? And I think the part that's been missing in the past is that education around what should we do if our vehicle gets struck by lightning. And so having a true safety professional somewhere, whether it's somebody we call and bring in from time to time, or whether they're sitting in the regional office, is a good thing to have. And if they're good on the human side, the psychological side, or the sociology side, then I think it all sort of adds color and quality to the conversation.
Great.
Well, exactly with that example, I'd rather prefer a guy who knows more about lightning than about people to advise me.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for your time today, and for diving into Deming's principles. And where can folks find you, Brian, if they want to connect and ask a question or two?
Probably through LinkedIn is the most neutral aspect. the advisory role that I'm playing is for one specific company, so I prefer not to do it that way, but I am on LinkedIn and my contact details are there.
Great. Corey, and we know where to track you down.
Yeah, I'm just around. I'll be around.
Well, thanks so much. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.